Also, the Wall Street Journal report from over the weekend, really a bombshell investigation into the Nancy Guthrie disappearance and mistakes that were made with the investigation. These are things that I've talked to you guys about before, but there were some new tidbits in the article, and I actually have the journalist who wrote the article. And it's Wall Street Journal. I mean, they have a ton of sources, high-level federal sources, so you're going to hear everything that she uncovered. And it's just interesting because I kind of feel like I've been in the weeds every day, and if you follow me, you've probably been in the weeds with me with every little development. But she's kind of taking a look at it from sort of a 30,000 foot view, and they got all sorts of call logs and transactional details and all sorts of stuff. So I'm going to get into all of that coming up in this episode of Brian Ensign Investigates. Hey guys, so the situation is interesting with
a dried stain on a front porch. That's where this case actually broke. Not months later, not in a lab, but in the first few hours, when a stain the size of a dinner plate sat on Nancy Guthrie's doorstep and nobody with a badge decided it mattered. Picture that porch. A grandmother's welcome mat, a potted plant, and blood, hers, as it would later be confirmed, treated for hours as background noise. That single image is this entire case in miniature, evidence in plain sight, in a department that looked right past it. Before we go deeper into what the records actually show, make sure you're subscribed to the Crime Infinity, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence.
Valerie Bauerlein, and she was one of the journalists who wrote this big expose over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal, really just detailing all of the shortcomings and issues with the Nancy Guthrie investigation, especially early on. Mistakes that I've talked about that were made for a long time in terms of like inexperienced homicide detectives and the fact that the crime scene was cleared so quickly, but also things that I didn't know a ton about, like the blood spatter at the front door and the fact that they just thought it was dried blood from a previous incident, and also the lead homicide detective who had an issue with the previous case pretty recently, which she gets into. So I want to play for you guys my full interview with Valerie. I think you'll think it's interesting. And just the fact that the Wall Street Journal did this story. I mean, like, nothing against me. I know, I'm doing my best and boots on the ground, but there is just sort of a certain gravitas, I guess, that comes with like a paper like the Wall Street Journal digging into a lot of this stuff. And it was a big deal that they did this big Sunday spread, not only on Nancy Guthrie missing, but really being very critical of the sheriff's office and decisions that were made early on. So here's my conversation with Valerie.
Here's the official timeline. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of Today show anchor Savannah Guthrie, was dropped off at her Tucson home just before 10 p.m. on January 31st. By late Sunday morning, she was gone. No phone, no medication, a propped open door. Family called it in at 12:03 p.m. Sheriff Nanos would later stand at a podium and tell the public that a crime had been committed, that she hadn't left on her own. That's the official record. Here's the irony. According to the Wall Street Journal's 6-month investigation, published August 1st and built from personnel files and interviews with current and former officials, the man Sheriff Nanos put in charge of the homicide unit.
Hi, Valerie. It's nice to see you. Thank you for joining me. I've been an admirer of yours for quite some time with all the Alec Murdaugh coverage that you did. So I was really interested when I saw that you wrote a story about Nancy Guthrie and kind of where things stand. And it's getting a ton of reaction. And I was really interested in your thoughts because I've kind of been, and you know how it is when you covered Murdaugh, like I've been kind of in the weeds on all of it, like every day since it started. So to sort of take a step back and read your story, and I'm just curious, what you thought, kind of digging into it, big picture, what surprised you?
No, and vice versa. I'm a fan of yours, Brian, and I just loved the idea at CrimeCon that you're 200 days on the road. You really do a lot of this boots on the ground reporting on these big stories. We just felt like it was such a high profile case 6 months ago, and there was so many incremental pieces of information. It was really hard to figure out where we were in the case. So we figured for our readers at the Wall Street Journal, if you like a lot of lay people in this country that didn't follow every turn of the screw here, what if we just tried to figure out what happened? What were the steps of the investigation so far, and where are we? How close are we to solving the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie? So, you and more than many people have done the every, you said weeds, but kind of like trees. Every tree, here's the tree, here I am. And we just thought there was an opportunity to say, what does the forest look like, and are we any closer to finding her than we were February 1st?
Sergeant David Stivers had been formally reprimanded just 2 months before Guthrie disappeared. The reason? Poor judgment tied to delays securing crime scene evidence in a homicide case. That's not speculation. That's in his file. The man responsible for protecting evidence had already been written up for failing to protect evidence, and he was still handed the biggest case in the department's history.
We were very hopeful that we were going to find, oh, this is the new direction that the investigation is in, or this is what's happening behind the curtain that's not apparent. There's so much more going on behind the scenes. But I just, as a human being, I'm kind of sad to say we didn't find that. I think what we found was that through there was so that, and we saw it with the Murdoch case, and we saw it with so many of these cases that you cover, Kohlberg and others. Your opportunity to get the most and best information you can is that first 24 and 48 hours. And there were so many decisions made in that critical time period that were missteps, bad luck, bad calls, and then some of that information you were never able to recover. So I think it was known that, it was certainly known you filmed your camera operator walking up to the crime scene a couple days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. There was a lot of coverage of the Domino's pizza guy walking up and putting 3 pieces. So I think that, we knew that the crime scene was not kept pristine the way it might have been in other high profile cases. But that set them really back on their heels. But in fairness, I mean, there were some missteps early on, but there were also some really bad luck, right? There's been no breaks. The FBI is able to kind of miraculously reformat this footage from bits and bytes at Google for the Nest camera that was not in a subscription, but that didn't break it open. And 9 times out of 10, right? I mean, the Boston bomber or Luigi Mangione, that footage gets out in the world and someone says, I think I know, or I think I recognize, or it would make sense. What if it were this person? And that just didn't happen in this case. So there were sort of like some bad calls, some bad luck, but then also, and I think this is what you and many people who have been following the case recently have felt, a little bit of bad blood, kind of like bad feeling between different parties. And then also this social media phalanx of people that are on the ground filming in the dead of night, or the neighbors have been very upset about things of that nature. There's some, and there's also been some bad information coming out of tips through social. So there was just a combination in our view, and most importantly, maybe this bad relationship, the kind of cross purposes that the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff seem to be at times. So in my mind, it wasn't one thing as far as we haven't found her. It was sort of this combination of bad calls, bad luck, and bad relations, bad feeling.
So when Stivers and his team arrived at the Guthrie house, what happened? Investigators reportedly gave little attention to the dried blood on the porch, treating it as though it might be nothing more than an unrelated head bump or a nosebleed. Testing later confirmed it belonged to Nancy. It's now believed to be tied directly to her abduction.
I think it's a combination of things. There were clearly mistakes made in the beginning. I was out there and I told you when the crime scene tape
Yeah.
was taken down so quickly, I thought that was unusual. I mean, I've been at crime scenes before where they'll keep the tape up for 3 weeks and just have
Yeah.
someone sitting out there to make sure nobody goes inside. So that was surprising. I had reported that early on they were under the assumption that she may have walked off or
Mhm.
it was some kind of, sort of like accident, and that feeling and assumption lasted longer than it should have. But
Yeah.
something new in your story, which I had never really nailed down before, was specifically about the blood. I
Mhm.
didn't realize, and you reported this, that they initially thought the blood was, what did they think it was, like old blood, or describe
It
that
could
part of
have
your
been, I
reporting.
mean, so Nancy Guthrie had a kind of a phalanx of health problems. She's 84 years old. And one of those problems were heart problems and a pacemaker and things. So is it possible that if she was on blood thinners, for example, is it, if you have a parent or a grandparent who takes those, a nosebleed can cause this profuse bleeding. And I think with the family, as I understand, often comes, particularly when they dropped her off that night, she went in through the garage. And then when they enter the house, it's the back door that we find out later that's propped open. Is there a world where there's some diminishment of that front porch and the blood, particularly since the camera was gone? But I should say, in fairness, you're exactly right about the initial hours of there was deliberation that took a long time. The family was saying she wouldn't wander off. She was mentally sharp as a tack. She played mahjong. She went to Bible study. She read every book that came out, but she was physically weak. And it was a big day for her when she could walk back and forth to the mailbox without assistance. But the sheriff, I mean, and in fairness, they get a missing person case almost every day. Either the hikers out there in that desert to get dehydrated or lost, or all the retirees who move out there because it's the air so good and the quality of life is high. They get a missing person almost every day. And Sunday at noon, you roll up and you think what you have is a zebra, right? It looks like a zebra, but it turns out it's a unicorn of a case, the only open missing persons case in Piedmont County.
And while detectives were debating whether that stain mattered, the scene itself sat wide open. Deputies failed to tape off the property, and reporters, live streamers, and even delivery drivers walked right up to the porch. Every footprint, every touch, every stray fiber from every stranger who wandered up those steps. That's contamination a crime lab can never fully filter back out. Here's your ticking clock moment. What if the first 6 hours after Nancy Guthrie vanished were the only 6 hours that ever mattered, and everyone treated them like there'd be time to make it up later? There wasn't. And they didn't. They didn't lose the case in 6 months. They lost it in 6 hours. Because it wasn't only the porch. The Journal's reporting also points to the department's search and rescue plane, grounded for hours in those critical early stretches, waiting on a deputy qualified to operate its surveillance system. Meanwhile, the department's senior pilot had reportedly been demoted just days before Guthrie disappeared, following an unrelated workplace complaint. 2 separate personnel decisions, made for 2 separate reasons, collided at the exact moment a search plane needed to be in the air over the desert looking for an 84-year-old woman without her medication. That's not bad luck. That's not a coincidence anyone can hide behind. That's a department whose internal staffing problems bled directly into the most time-sensitive hours of a live abduction case. They didn't lose the case in 6 months. They lost it in 6 hours. Now hold that against what the sheriff has said publicly. Nanos has repeatedly insisted the case is moving, that he can assure everybody they are working hard every day with all of their partners, including corporate America, which has offered assistance with some of the brightest minds in the country, and that the case is not cold. Compare that confidence to what his own department's personnel files show about who was put in charge and what was missed in the opening hours. Those 2 things exist in the same investigation. They don't sit comfortably next to each other. There's a political layer here too, and the record shows it plainly. Nanos won re-election in November 2024 by a margin measured in a few hundred votes after a recount.
Yeah, and that kind of backs up some of what I found. Like when I first got to Arizona, I realized pretty quickly, just talking to people on the ground and talking to law enforcement, that we kind of arrived and Nancy went missing right in the middle of kind of like some political turmoil with the
Yeah,
sheriff.
yeah.
He only won by a couple hundred votes. And you mentioned this in your story. I mean, he had a vote of no confidence. Um, Most of the
From half of his
deputies,
deputies in
yeah,
March. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And it seems the sense I have is really most of the deputies um, don't really like him as sheriff. So it's kind of a bit of a, and I don't know if this is the vibe you got, like it's a bit of a dysfunctional sheriff's
Well, when I
office, I
watched
think.
that interview you did with the detective who had left, and he identified some of those issues early on. I did cover the cop beat full time when I was younger. I covered night cops for 3 years, and covering any law enforcement agency, you realize it's a human business too. You're doing a hugely difficult job under immense pressure, but it's all humans in the workplace too. And I think yes, he had won. He had narrowly won in November of 24 by a couple hundred votes in a recount. That in a big place of a million people, that is a narrow margin. And he'd been challenged by an insider who he'd sidelined, and he'd also sidelined the head of the union. And there was a lot of bad feeling, and a lot of people were moved after the election. And And that, like, as you mentioned, there was the vote of no confidence in March, just in his performance in general, not the Guthrie case specifically. And the Board of Supervisors as well has had a lot. The county Board of Supervisors, they are not able to, or they tried, but they're not able to strip him of his position. He's rightfully elected, but he's had some. He's been on his heels defending his job in general for several months, and that also, I just think, as human beings, creates a distraction within the department.
His challenger in that race, Heather Lappin, told reporters in February that some of the department's most experienced homicide detectives had been removed from that unit. Detectives, she says, had backed her campaign.
Yeah, no, for sure. Did you find that, and you kind of you wrote about this, and I sort of was reading behind between the lines a little bit of what I think you were trying to say in the article, but like it seemed like initially President Trump and Kash Patel, the FBI director, were kind of gung ho and like almost wanted to be part of it when they thought that they would maybe be able to help and have a positive resolution and not be able to take credit, but you know what I mean? Almost be
Yeah.
like there to say, hey, we solved it. But it almost seems like the more time that goes by and the more difficult it becomes to make progress, like they're almost distancing themselves.
Well, it's fine. I was gonna we wanted to talk more about what was happening this spring and into the summer because that's the current timeline, but I ended up I printed this out and put it on my desk. It's just the month of February because so many of the critical decisions were made here. And yes, you're right, she was taken that Sunday the 1st, and President Trump kind of weighs in on the 4th and says we're going to send all of these federal resources. And then you have he Janke, the special agent in charge at the time, saying on the 5th, we are the cavalry's here. This is a joint investigation. And then that Monday, what we found was that's when Kash Patel shows up on the ground. But you know what's surprising? He showed up on Monday the 9th, but from checking the plane records, all the different records, he was on the ground for less than 6 hours on the 9th, right? So he shows up on the 9th and then the next morning tweets out that bombshell, this big break of the video that the FBI, to their credit, had recovered that no one thought. The sheriff had said it was unrecoverable. And he said that night on Hannity, I think this has led to some major breaks in 24, 36 hours. I think there may be persons of interest. And in fact, there was an arrest. There was a person who was detained that night and later cleared. But that's it. We really tried to scour Kash Patel, who's the FBI director, obviously, scour his social media, scour his public statements. What has he said since that first big splash? And the answer is virtually nothing, except in May when he had that interview with Sean Hannity again, saying that the FBI had been frozen out of the initial days. And then when we pressed hard for an on the record comment from Washington, that was, as you saw as well, look, we have been, it is a state investigation. It's not our investigation. We will help when we're asked type thing. So yeah, I think the president for sure spoke to Savannah early on, pledged federal help. I think on the ground, our strong understanding is the local FBI agents are working hard every day, working this case 12 hours a day. But from the top, there seems to have been very little said since that initial first flurry of activity in February.
Yeah, and what's also interesting about the Kash Patel visit is I remember when he came to Arizona, his office was kind of downplaying it, saying I think they were saying he had a different like a speech to give or a meeting, a pre-planned event,
They
and they
said it
were
was,
real.
and you remember there were several tweets that showed him meeting with Native American interests, meeting with other sorts of interests, pictures, that photo ops there. So yeah, that was it was billed as a pre-planned visit.
Yeah,
Whether or not that reshuffling is the reason Stivers ended up running homicide, the timeline is public, the recount is public, and the personnel moves are public. Readers can connect those dots for themselves. Then there's the FBI's role, which has its own gap. Kash Patel made a high-profile appearance on the ground in the case's opening days, releasing surveillance images the sheriff's office had called unrecoverable.
wrong here because Kash Patel has repeatedly said they were kept out. Nanos has said no, we had someone from the task force who was there from almost the beginning. But at the same time, the FBI didn't get to do their evidence um, check, when until days later. I'm still not entirely clear with who's really, I guess, telling the truth, or it's a little
I think with
murky.
all complex situations, O'Brien, we felt the same. There's a lot of reasons that this case hasn't been solved, and it's not just this one person did this thing or
Yeah.
someone didn't do that thing. There are a lot of tumblers that didn't fall in the right order. But we worked really hard on that data point. When did the FBI get involved? And our understanding from Pima County is that the Pima County Sheriff's deputy who is on the task force, the federal task force, was informed that afternoon, right? So that day, so you could say we informed the FBI. One of the task force members was there, but it's a local person in the Pima
Mm.
County Sheriff's Office. And when you remember that day that the FBI just the house gets turned back over to the Guthrie family on that Monday, the second. But then the FBI shows up in force, I want to say Wednesday evening, the 4th, and recanvasses, does a grid search, goes back in the house, pulls more samples. So the evidence supports to us that the FBI's involvement really began about the middle of that first week. Yeah.
Okay, because it was basically a deputy who was on the FBI task force, not
So I
technically
think I
like
think
a
you can
real.
so you can say did Sheriff Nanos inform the FBI task force? Yes, he says he did through this person. Was Quantico, the big FBI, involved? Not when Cash Patel said we didn't get involved for 4 days. That is also has some that can also be supported by the fact. But I think what's clear is that ransom note, and the law says this, this digital communication, if those ransom notes were real or even suspected to be real, that's the purview of the FBI. So that's when they really get involved for sure. So.
Do you know if the FBI take over if they wanted to? I mean, is there some federal crime that they could say, no, it's ours now?
I don't know that it happens that way very often, right? I think typically, um, it's a joint effort, but one person's really in charge. I think the multi-jurisdictional nature here gave a lot of ability to say, we're not that's not us, that's not on us. But I think as a practical matter, if President Trump wanted the FBI to be in charge, um, my strong sense is they would be.
Yeah, I just kind of wonder if it's such a mess at this
Meaning, I don't know if
point.
it's a legal thing. I think if there was the political will to make that happen,
Right.
then maybe that would have happened. But again, I don't know.
Yeah.
Since then, the journal notes the FBI declined to make Patel available for further comment, deferring to Pima County as the lead agency. A federal director who showed up loud in week 1 and has said almost nothing publicly since. That silence is itself part of the record. They didn't lose the case in 6 months. They lost it in 6 hours. And what's left, 6 months on, is a family still waiting. Savannah Guthrie posted, in her own words, that she and her siblings have carried every moment, every breath, and every heartbeat of this in agony since it began.
And it was the headline of the story was "How can someone vanish without a trace?" Savannah Guthrie said that, right, in that interview back in
Mm.
April with Hoda Kotb, and that is so we tried to rely on that long interview for anything we had, any of her public statements that we wanted to reveal how she was thinking about things. So that's a good one to go back and watch because she says things in there like the doors were propped open and that type of stuff. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I've always been a fan of hers, and she has shown amazing strength, I think, through this whole thing. I've just
I
kind
think
of
she's one of
wondered.
the most beloved women in America, which is part of
Yeah,
the reason why, you know, it's hard to fathom that, because she's so relatable, because she's so personable, she shares her life, her feelings about things, and that would be, and she has said she wonders if it was because of her visibility that her mother was vulnerable, which is just heartbreaking.
yeah, it is. I've just wondered with her. I mean, she's so smart. She's a lawyer. She's done crime
Yeah,
stories forever. On Today Show, she worked for Court TV before that. She's
yeah.
covered police investigations just like you and I have. I would imagine behind the scenes, I mean, everything you laid out in your story, she's aware of. There must be some frustrations, but I guess she probably wants to keep her messaging on track at this point because her mom, that's really the main thing.
Yeah, I can imagine in that position. I would just, what you're relying on law enforcement, you know.
Yeah.
You're
Right.
relying on the cavalry to do it. And no, but she has been very, she did not talk with us. She's been very specific about her public,
Mm.
on the record statements. So
Yeah, right. And I guess working for NBC too, it's kind of like there's a whole process there. Is there anything else, Valerie, that you think is important? You did a great
um
job with the story.
well, no, and thank you for having me. I'm one of your followers, and I think
Oh,
I've
thanks.
watched most of your broadcasts on this case. I think it just was one of those stories where we wanted to find out that there was more going on than
Ransom notes were eventually released to the public, one claiming Nancy had died shortly after she was taken. No arrest, no recovery, no answer to the only question that has ever mattered. Where is she? What the Wall Street Journal's reporting establishes isn't guilt.
appears to be on the surface. And sadly, just as a human being, that's not what we found. So that raises a question. And I think Sheriff Nanos has said this in his interviews lately. It's not clear whether this is weeks, months, or years from being resolved. You know.
Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunate. But well, thank you for your time, Valerie.
Well, thank you.
It isn't a name. It's a pattern. A porch that wasn't sealed, a homicide sergeant with a reprimand already in his file, a plane that couldn't fly when it needed to, a sheriff whose public confidence hasn't matched his own department's paper trail. None of that tells us who took Nancy Guthrie. All of it tells us why, 6 months later, nobody official can say. If you want to check this yourself, the Wall Street Journal's investigative piece, published the evening of August 1st, 2026, lays out the personnel records and sourcing in full. Read it, and then tell me in the comments. Do you think this case stalls out because of who took her, or because of what was mishandled before anyone even started looking? If this kind of evidence-based breakdown is what you come here for, hit like, share this with someone following the case, subscribe, and turn on notifications for the Crime Infinity, because we'll be back the moment the record changes.